The washcloth dropped from my hands as I noticed a blurry figure in the mirror. It wasn't me. In that terrifying instant, I realized my privacy had been violated in the worst possible way. The shock of it hit me like a wave, and I stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. Hi everyone, welcome to Revenge Echo. Let's get started. The first time I realized something was wrong with my father-in-law, William Holloway, was on the night we moved into his house. Mark, my husband, insisted it was only temporary. Just until we save enough to buy our own place, he promised. But temporary stretched into months, and the mansion that was once a refuge now felt like a prison. William was always polite, even overly so. He was a retired judge, a man who carried an aura of authority that made people sit up straighter in his presence. His voice was calm, decisive, and everything about him exuded propriety. But there were moments, small, fleeting, when I caught him looking at me. Not in the way a father-in-law should. Once, when I came downstairs in the morning, I caught his eyes scanning my body before quickly looking away. A furtive glance, lasting only a second, but it left a chilling sensation. Then there were other times I felt his gaze following me as I walked past the hallway, when I bent down to pick something up, or when I was accidentally alone with him in the kitchen. Still, I tried to reassure myself that I was just overthinking things. He was Mark's father, a respectable man. But day by day, those small incidents became more frequent, like ripples on the water's surface before a real storm hits. One night, when Mark was sound asleep, I woke up to get a drink of water. As I walked down to the kitchen, I suddenly saw a shadow standing silently in the darkness, right near the window. My heart pounded when I realized it was William. He didn't say anything, just stood there, looking out into the backyard. But I had a clear feeling that he knew I was there. And as I quietly turned away, I could still feel his eyes on me until I disappeared back into the bedroom. I started locking the bedroom door at night. And I started counting down the days until Mark and I could leave this house. With each passing day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Small changes, but so sharp that they couldn't be ignored. Every time I walked through the hallway, I had the sensation of a gaze following me, as if a silent shadow was clinging to my every step. At first, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. But then, the more time passed, the stronger that presence felt. Ordinary moments like me bending down to pick up a dropped item, or when I passed him in the kitchen, his eyes lingered, no different from a silent surveillance. I began to wonder if I was living in a glass box where my every action was being monitored, impossible to hide. But the strangest thing was that no one said anything, not a single warning. William, who always wore a calm exterior, always had an expression as if he held everything in his hands, but his eyes, sometimes, were a silent wound I couldn't touch. The feeling of being watched wasn't just ordinary attention. It was something that penetrated every corner of my mind, like a ghost in the house. Every time I wondered about it, I was tormented by my own feelings. Was I too sensitive? Or was there really something happening that I couldn't understand? His silence, that was what confused me the most. He didn't do anything too obvious for me to confront him and demand an explanation. He just stood there, making me feel like an object being observed. And I couldn't escape that feeling. The more I tried to dismiss it, the more I felt like I was slowly being drawn into a game whose rules I didn't understand. I started noticing small things. Used hairbrushes that weren't mine. A few bras that mysteriously went missing. Traces I couldn't explain, things I thought only I would notice. Was William marking his presence in this space by leaving those small traces so that I would think about him every minute of every second? This feeling, though small, weighed heavily on me every day. Sometimes I couldn't sleep because I thought about him possibly standing outside the door, just a second more, and I would see him appear in the darkness. But perhaps the scariest thing was when I realized I couldn't escape this feeling. I had become too accustomed to the tension, too accustomed to the dark shadows lurking in the corners of the house, that I no longer knew what was real and what was imagination. When the feeling of being watched became a part of my daily life, I no longer knew if I could continue living without looking around in fear, without looking into mirrors or window frames just to make sure I wasn't being secretly observed. And I began to think that I would never escape this surveillance, no matter how hard I tried. Everything always starts simply, doesn't it? One ordinary evening, I went into the bathroom to take a shower after a long, tiring day. I didn't think much, just wanted to relax in the warm water, to let the water wash away all the stress of a difficult workday. Yet, in just a few seconds, a strange feeling washed over me, as if a cold breeze had brushed against my body, even though there wasn't a breeze at all. I thought I was just worrying too much, but the feeling was too intense to ignore. It was the feeling of someone watching me, and not in a normal way. A gaze that seemed to be waiting, probing my every movement, every gesture, making me feel like I had become the subject of a dangerous game. At first, I told myself not to panic. After all, I was just taking a shower, and this was my private space. But then, in the slightly fogged-up mirror, I saw a reflection, blurry and fleeting, like a dark shadow that had just flashed and disappeared. Who was it? My heart pounded. I couldn't believe my eyes. Was I imagining all of this? But that moment was too clear. That image couldn't have been a coincidence. I felt like everything around me started to slow down, and in that moment, I became prey, with no way to escape. That feeling, the feeling of being monitored, being watched, began to tighten around me. My head was spinning. Could William be standing out there? Could he have been waiting for me, just waiting for the moment I was vulnerable to step in? For a brief second, I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My tongue felt stiff, unable to utter a word. I stood frozen, my heart beating faster than ever, as if I was standing face to face with a predator. A soft sound came from outside the door. It was a small noise, almost inaudible. But it made me feel like I had been electrocuted. Every nerve in my body tensed up, and I felt like I was trapped in a snare I couldn't escape. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to throw off the towel, rush outside, but I didn't dare. I felt my body stiffen, as if I had been imprisoned in this very bathroom. Everything around me became blurred, as if it was no longer real. And then, like a release, the sound of the front door opening echoed. Mark's voice called out from outside, "I'm home. Where are you?" I felt like I had been awakened from a nightmare. I stood silently, unable to react immediately. I didn't know what to say, feeling like I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched that was weighing down on me. At that moment, I didn't know if I should feel safer or even more afraid. Mark came in, completely unaware of what had just happened. But I felt like I couldn't tell the truth. Right now, I had the feeling that no words would be enough to explain, only making things more complicated. But the scariest thing was the feeling of not being able to escape. The feeling that that shadow, William's shadow, was still clinging to me, no matter what I did. That feeling never went away, even with Mark by my side. In those moments, I wasn't just worried about being watched, but also afraid that there was some truth I didn't know, a dark truth about this house, about William, and about myself. When Mark walked into the house, he had no idea he was stepping into a silent war. He just thought he was coming home after a tiring day at work, hoping to relax and see his wife in a peaceful space. But as soon as the door opened, a heavy and unusual feeling greeted him. A strange silence hung in the air. Mark's footsteps were normal at first, but the deeper he went into the house, the more hurried they became. He couldn't explain why the atmosphere in the house was so strangely tense. He sensed something was wrong, something had changed in that space. When he heard the sound from the bathroom, his heart sank. Something wasn't right. He quickened his pace, his heart beating faster, a sudden feeling of unease washing over him. He couldn't imagine the reason why, but somehow his intuition couldn't be wrong. Something had happened. When he saw the figure of his father, William, standing there, he couldn't help but be stunned. All the reflexes in his body seemed to freeze for a moment. He couldn't believe his eyes. William, the man he had always respected, the father he still thought of as an upright man, was in his wife's bathroom. Even when Mark looked into his father's eyes, he didn't see embarrassment, didn't see awkwardness or confusion. Instead, he maintained a frighteningly calm demeanor. In that moment, feelings of pain and resentment flooded Mark's heart. He couldn't suppress the anger that was surging through his body. The thought of his wife's betrayal was a shock he could hardly accept. But when he saw William's composure, an even worse feeling arose within him. Not only had his wife betrayed him, but even the father he had once admired was standing there, in that space, with a cold and unrepentant attitude. He wanted to scream, but all that remained was an emptiness. A feeling of disappointment spread throughout his body. There was no immediate anger, but a very strange feeling. It was despair. It was the realization that everything he had known, everything he had loved, had been destroyed right before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to save it. Mark couldn't recognize his wife, couldn't understand the person he had once loved, the person who had given him a completely different view of himself. His wife's words, the glances she had given him, all seemed like lies now shattered into irreparable fragments. Everything was just a play with no happy ending, a play in which he was both the main character and the victim. When Mark looked into his father's eyes, everything seemed to collapse within him. The respect and love he had for William no longer existed. He felt brutally betrayed by both of the most important people in his life. A scream wanted to escape his throat, but he could only utter a short, painful sentence. "Don't tell me this is just a misunderstanding, Dad. I'm not stupid." He started walking towards William, his hands clenched, his body trembling with anger and despair. A part of him wanted to maintain respect, wanted a rational confrontation. But when he saw the image of his wife, an uncontrollable feeling surged, an anger that couldn't fill the pain in his heart. He pushed his father hard against the wall, without any restraint. "Get out of my house right now," he yelled. But in William's eyes, he saw defeat, a father who had shattered everything he had built. With that short sentence, Mark knew that nothing could salvage this relationship anymore. His feeling at this moment was not just anger, but also disappointment, the shattering of a family he had trusted. Both he and his wife had been deceived, but the worst part was that it was beyond saving. When the truth was revealed in that tense moment of confrontation, Mark stood as if turned to stone, feeling like all the strength had drained from his body. All the chaotic emotions within him stagnated, abruptly ceasing. He couldn't believe what he had just heard, what he had just seen. William's presence in the bathroom was not simply a mistake or an unexpected situation, but had become a real shock, inexplicable in words. What had transpired in the bathroom, the furtive glances, the inappropriate touches, had now turned into irreparable fragments. His relationship with his wife, with his father, now only remained as unsalvageable wreckage. Everything was laid bare under the light of betrayal. Mark felt like a ship torn apart, shattered by roaring waves. He knew there was no turning back. Anger surged within Mark, but it wasn't ordinary anger. It was a numbing sensation, an internal destruction. He was not only angry that his wife had betrayed him, but also at himself for not realizing it sooner. He blamed himself for not seeing the small signs, for not listening to his instincts. He felt like a fool who had built an illusion of happiness with his own hands, only for it all to vanish when the truth was exposed. Standing opposite William, he didn't just see a man who had once been a role model, but also a betrayer, a father who had shattered everything he had ever believed in. The feeling of being deceived by the father he loved was too great a shock. As an adult man, Mark had thought he could face any difficulty, but in this moment, he felt weak and helpless. His words when he yelled at William to leave the house were not just rage. It was a cry from the depths of his heart, a declaration that he could no longer continue living in a family where respect and trust were gone. He wanted William to leave, not just because of the betrayal, but because he felt too tired of what had happened. He couldn't live in a house where everything had become false, where the people he loved had become those who hurt him the deepest. But what Mark felt was deeper than anger. He felt an irreparable loss. Loss of trust, of love, of family. The feeling he had never imagined, the feeling that he was no longer a part of his wife's life, and, even, no longer a part of his father's life. As for his wife, she stood silently, her eyes lowered, not daring to face him. But her silence was like a confession, a painful acknowledgement that everything had changed beyond repair. Mark no longer recognized his wife, the one he had once considered his life partner, the one who would accompany him for the rest of his life. Everything now was a false facade that he couldn't bear. William's presence in the room only increased the tension. Mark couldn't stand seeing his father still standing there, without a hint of remorse. Everything Mark had ever thought about this father, respect, love, had shattered like broken glass. Every word William spoke only made Mark angrier and more disappointed. William didn't apologize, didn't show any regret. He simply tried to maintain his composure, but in Mark's eyes, he had lost all respect and admiration. Mark felt like he was being dragged into a war he couldn't win. He couldn't understand why both his wife and his father could do this to him. He not only felt betrayed, but also felt like a loser in his own life. Everything he had once believed in now lay in scattered fragments around him. But within him, a determination began to form. If everything had collapsed, then there was nothing left to hold on to. He couldn't live in a family like this anymore. He had to let go, had to leave everything behind. A difficult decision, but also a necessary one. Mark knew that no matter how painful it was, he had to face the truth and cut off these relationships to find peace for himself. The atmosphere in the house then became so cold that I could feel the silence weighing down on everyone. After Mark had pushed William out of the house, neither of them said a word. The whole room seemed to freeze, with only the sound of my ragged breathing and Mark's heavy footsteps echoing through the hallway. I didn't know what to do anymore. No words could soothe the hurt I had caused. I looked into Mark's eyes, now filled with confusion and pain. He wasn't angry with me, at least not visibly. But I knew that, deep down, I had hurt the most sacred thing to him, his trust. I no longer knew what to say. No apology was strong enough to fix what had happened. And I certainly couldn't go back to mend this relationship. At this moment, I realized that I had lost everything. Not only Mark's trust, but also my own self-respect. Mark said nothing, just went into the bedroom and closed the door. I heard the sound of water running from the bathroom, the sound of someone trying to soothe the wounds in their soul. But I couldn't do anything but stand there, feeling each tear silently fall. So everything had collapsed. My relationship with Mr. William, no matter where it had started, was now just a pile of rubble, beyond saving. And Mark, he would never forgive me. The price to pay was too high. I went outside and sat on the steps, looking up at the pitch-black night sky, feeling like the whole world was turning its back on me. Everything I had ever had, everything I had ever cherished, had now vanished like smoke. I didn't know what I would do next. I had nowhere to go, no one to cling to. Tears continued to fall, but I no longer felt regret. Not because I didn't love Mark, but because I knew it was too late for everything. I had crossed every limit I could, and now I had to live with what I had done. My whole family had broken apart, and I was the one who destroyed it. There could only be one ending to this story, an ending with no turning back. Mark would never look at me the same way again. And I would forever live with the loneliness I had created myself.